Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Let me turn off my heater. I think it makes noise. It's time for our Saturday book, and it feels like it's been a million years because we didn't do a book this last weekend. Time has no meaning. So we last did Linda Moulton Howe's wonderful books, Glimpses of Other Realities. Finished volume 1. We returned to, when I finally got the book, to volume 2. And it opened up a very interesting perspective, in my opinion, one that you don't hear a lot of, although it's occurring more often, about the whole issue of alien contact, UFOs, all these unusual, as she calls it, high strangeness that may go beyond, the science fiction veneer that people give it. This may actually be science, and science may actually be metaphysics. And as I repeat over and over, physics on one end of the continuum, metaphysics on the other, and they're meeting in the middle. Now, this week's book was recommended by a subscriber. Thank you. I hesitated. I saw a brief thing that the author did on YouTube, and I was still not certain because he is or was a Christian pastor. Now, I'm not, inherently, well, maybe I am. I was going to say I'm not inherently prejudiced against that, but I always take people's context to heart before I decide what I think about what they're saying. And I was a little concerned going into this that this would be yet another Christian dismissal of anything not coming from a Christian perspective. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Now, he does talk about the Bible, but I think you'll be pleasantly surprised about his conclusions. And when I saw on the book that he had been on George Norrie's show, Coast to Coast, I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. And it was. So I'm talking about Paul Wallis's book, Escaping from Eden. It's the first of a series. And if this presentation gets enough positive feedback, I might consider doing other books in the series. The subtitle is, Does Genesis teach that the human race was created by God or engineered by ETs? So, it's kind of like the Bible meets Zecharia Sitchin and Jacques Vallée. So, let's dig right into it. This was written in 2020 by Paul Wallis. And the first chapter, there's an introduction where he explains his situation, and then he gets into the bulk of the book. And it's been a few weeks, and I don't remember if I wrote down what his situation was. Okay, I don't think I did. So he broke his leg. And he and his wife had put one of those little tiny houses, mother-in-law type detached buildings in their yard, and they were thinking that it would serve both purposes. It would be good for relatives, possibly permanently, but in the meantime they were going to rent it out and try to make some money. But he broke his leg, and he was so immobile that it was easier because of the floor plan, etc., of their house compared to this little house. He decided to just live in the little house while he healed, and he was in a big old cast, and for a long time he couldn't get around at all. And he thought, well, what am I going to do with myself? And he decided to go through, because as you would, right, go through the Bible bit by bit and really parse the language of it, because apparently this guy is conversant with the Greek and or the Latin and or maybe Hebrew or Aramaic. I'm not clear, but he obviously has linguistic knowledge, and he decided to try to make peace for himself in what he has always considered inconsistencies in scripture of all sorts, but specifically, the Old Testament, that made no sense to him. They seemed like contradictions, and there was a cognitive dissonance, and he decided, well, let's just really get down to the heart of it. So he says he did what many people do. He decided to try to make sense of scriptures. And he said this book is written like a documentary where he shares his journey, and it's very chatty. It's really a nice, easy read. He was asked, you call yourself a Christian, but this book pulls the rug out from under 2,000 years of biblical interpretation. Who do you think you are? You hold up as examples of people who might be on the right track two theologians who were condemned for heresy. Where do you come off doing that? And Wallis knew, Paul Wallis, the author, Wallis knew that that this challenge was from people who were accepting biblical orthodoxy, and that it was not a popular point of view to even question at all before you came to any opposing conclusions. So those clinging to conventional interpretations, he says, feared any new interpretation would bring the whole house down. There's a lot resting on the traditional interpretation of the Bible. History, change my page here. History and historians tried to take a look at religious sources from different points of view, and often that was rejected because it threatens people's claims on exclusive access to the kingdom of God. If you doubt the scriptures upon which people have built the foundation of their religious organizations and authority, you're shaking up the base, making things unstable for them, and they'll cling to their old beliefs even more tenaciously. And he says, people are creatures of habit. Not everybody is going to even have an interest in questioning anything. It's really hard to change people's minds about especially closely held religious beliefs. He said previous books on Celtic spirituality and Eastern Orthodox mysticism helped him to start getting a perspective. And he said for years he'd seen these anomalies in the texts of Christianity. And this injury he had, I forgot to mention because I forgot, he got this broken leg from playing ultimate frisbee. And the forced immobility gave him time alone to reevaluate some of the sources that he'd taken for granted without a pressure to make a real sense of them for other people. So he was doing this for himself. He wasn't preparing a sermon or a presentation, so he could leave things hanging as he worked them out. He wasn't required to tie everything up in a tidy 30-minute explanation. Oh, and he's Australian, by the way. So there's a comfort in the familiar canon of stories that people like to hear reaffirmed. We tell the same old fairy tales to the children, child after child, generation after generation. Goldilocks, the Three Little Pigs, Sleeping Beauty, all these old stories that come from kind of interesting backgrounds, which we ought to look at sometime. But religious stories are really clung to, and the big central belief is that God, this gigantic, all-powerful source, created everything and created us and created it all out of nothing and did it like in a week. So Wallis's time to contemplate all this forced him to confront the anomalies in the narrative where he had seen red flags. And he felt in his gut, something is off here. This makes no sense. I had a conversation, you might have seen, 1 or 2 hours of it the other day when Denise and I were talking. And she made reference to the fact that there are such inconsistencies in the Bible. And the minute you say that, you can just feel everybody tensing up. They don't want to be challenged. But if we want to be intellectually honest, these are things that need to be worked out. We're not doing it to prove true or false. We're doing it to understand. And the Bible is full of all sorts of inconsistencies, and commonly people just brush them off, make excuses. Well, this first chapter is a list of the anomalies in Genesis, and I'm not going to go into a ton of them because people are familiar, but the original language that they started with at the very beginning, God is plural, but then very quickly they start using the pronoun us. But if God is plural, who's us? I mean, if God is the only God and the first God, who's us? And then he refers to himself as a physical being, and he refers to himself as a plural. Now, it's written off as the royal we or whatever, but it's inconsistent. It goes back and forward. So in Genesis, I don't know if I want to actually take the time to read. Okay, well, I do have a nice, convenient, bold print. So Genesis starts out in the beginning. God made heaven and earth, blah, blah, blah. And then in Genesis 1:26, God refers to himself in the plural and says, let us make. Let us who? And then in the second chapter of Genesis, he says, this is an in-depth description of key mineral deposits that are in Eden. Gold is good, aromatic resin and onyx. It names the rivers, it names the lands, it names the Tigris and the Euphrates. So we're crossing into a kind of inexplicable fascination of the supreme deity with mineral rights. It's pretty interesting. And Wallis once again asks, doesn't that seem weird that the most all-powerful entity would be obsessing about onyx? And, it's just weird. In Genesis 2:17, they're told not to eat, Adam and Eve told not to eat from the tree, but why is the knowledge of good and evil bad for humans? That is a really basic question. You're not supposed to eat that fruit, become more knowledgeable, and understand the difference between good and evil. Wouldn't a supreme being want humans, to be ethical? If we have free will, wouldn't we need to have moral awareness? That would be essential. How would humans be able to choose good if they didn't know the difference between good and evil? This just makes no basic sense. It's like, the first people, we'll call them Adam and Eve for the sake of argument. Adam and Eve were set up to fail, and therefore they couldn't be responsible for any choices that they made. None of this makes logical sense. Also, would death be an expected punishment meted out by a loving God? Does it fit the crime? Wallis says it doesn't really fit the crime. And on a little farther into chapter 2 of Genesis, God creates Eve from Adam's rib. And how come an omniscient God didn't think about that ahead of time when he made Adam? Didn't it occur to him that Adam would want to compare? He's supposed to know everything. He just has the animals to fool around with, for companionship. Didn't God realize that would stop sufficing and Adam would get lonely? Wallis says, is this a short-sighted God? It just seems inconsistent. So Genesis chapter 3 talks about the snake, and so obviously this is not a snake because it's talking. It's got intelligence, and it speaks like a human, but it's not God, and it's not the humans. Who was it? Who created it? What is it? There's talk about it being a fallen angel, but the whole role of the snake and the devil, fallen angels, doesn't make a lot of sense if you think of it in terms of a loving God. Childbirth is given, the pain of childbirth is given as a punishment. Or Wallis asks, is it really a punishment, or was this a consequence for having sex? Was God kind of repressed? Was he offended? Did they get in trouble for having self-awareness? Were they being punished for becoming conscious and self-aware? Then God refers to himself in plural again, and then farther on in chapter 4, I wrote the page down, so I must want to read it to you. So Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel, he gets kicked out, mark of Cain. And in Genesis, Cain says, I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And Wallis says, excuse me? Who are these others? Who are these whoever finds him outside the Garden of Eden that he might run into? What's he talking about? Who is he talking about? Weren't they the only people created? What? Confusion. Then in chapter 6, it's the story of the flood, 2 by 2 animals into the ark. And he reminds the reader that Genesis really is a combination of different sources. And this story is common to a whole lot of cultures. Then it refers to Yahweh, but it also refers to the Elohim. And Yahweh is the holy name revealed for the first time, much later to Moses on the mountain. So why is God identifying himself as Yahweh here in Genesis? It's inconsistent. So what was the real original text? This is the conclusion that Wallis came to. We need to find the originals and try to figure out what the real words were and why they've been changed, or have they been changed, and what is the understanding, what's going on. So he said, why is God always plural, or sometimes plural and sometimes singular, and who are these Elohim? Sometimes it sounds like it's God, sometimes it sounds like it's entities. Were the original texts ever really even about God, a divine being at all? And in Genesis chapter 6, the Nephilim, how did they survive the flood? A really good question. Where did they come from? Now, there's a lot of theories, but not necessarily in Genesis. The gods copulated with the humans and, the Nephilim, whatever. This is weird. This is confusion. This is inconsistent. Let's try to clarify it. Who were the Bnei Elohim, the sons of God from Hebrew? Why did their offspring with humans make giants? Why did this lead to the flood? Why would a divine, loving source of all do something of such violent retribution? It's like when you have children, you get more positive results with the carrot than the stick. Wouldn't an all-knowing God understand that? Wouldn't there be the realization that people can be directed down the right path without all this anger and violence and revenge and jealousy and negative stuff? Wallis asks, who were these land barons, the Bnei Elohim? Were they human? What were they? And Some have called them angels, it also says in the Bible. And his response was, what? It's pretty funny. I told you this book is very chatty. It's an easy read. It's a very entertaining read. He doesn't get too much into the weeds, quoting chapter and verse, just enough. I'll show you how he does it. Just enough in these little bold headings of questions. He'll pull out in bold print what he wants to challenge, and then he'll discuss it, and it's really easy reading. Where am I? But okay, so these Elohim, they're not God, the God. They're not human. But if they're the product of gods and humans, then God's plural. What's that all about? So it seems to be an inference that the reader has already heard about them before. There's sort of an understanding here. You know who I'm talking about. You who are reading the Bible for the first time long ago, you know who we're talking about. And Wallis says, well, what? How do we know what you're talking about? How did these ancient people who first were exposed to the Bible, the Old Testament, how did they know who was being discussed? Where did this story come from? Chapter 20, the Elohim is plural. Some say Abraham used the plural because his audience was polytheistic. That's one of the conventional modern explanations. And then he cites a few more times where it's plural. And then he says a loving God is demanding Abraham to kill his son, but it's the Elohim that demand that Abraham kill his son. And this sounds like a pagan god demanding total obedience. This sort of sacrifice was not uncommon on a number of Greek islands, in the Near East, in Mesoamerica. He said the stakes are really high here because Isaac was the progenitor of a line of the people of Israel. So you get rid of him and now you've got a problem. So Yahweh stops the sacrifice, and somehow in this one story, you've got the Elohim and Yahweh, but they don't present at the same time. They present as the same entity involved in this plot line. Starting, stopping, starting, stopping. So what's going on? This makes it a story of a divine test, not a divine rescue. And Wallis's point of view is this is moral nonsense. He says this is not consistent with a loving, all-knowing, all-powerful supreme being. He cites the 1850s theologian who was sacked for suggesting for questioning the morality of even the existence of hell. He was fired from his position for breaking 3 laws. Thou shalt not question the Almighty. Thou shalt not expect thy God to adhere to any morality a mere mortal could understand. And thou shalt not have compassion for people thy God wishes to torment or kill. Those are the 11th through the 13th commandments. But then he says, we'll fail to notice that our God is acting like a monster. So this is how he describes this confrontation between, the traditional mainstream Christian church in the 1850s and a theologian who dared to question. So he says this story is essentially demanding that you never question authority, that you in religion do not question authority. We have more to talk about at another time about that. I can hardly wait. So he notes that in Genesis, every time the Elohim and Yahweh are equated, moral distortion happens, and we're forced to make excuses for a God that behaves immorally. And excuses are made. People will explain this away, but he thinks that that's intellectually false. So he recognized that the experts were glossing over a lot of this, and he decided to dig into the historic Jewish commentators. One said that God took counsel with the workers of heaven. Who? And another said, God took counsel with his own heart. Okay. And yet there was no further explanation for the plurals. One says that God acted in cooperation with the heavenly council, which was comprised of God and the powerful angels. And when did these angels get made? By the way, P.S., what are we talking about here? There's a reference to God telling 70 angels, let us go down. Okay. So he notes that there are go down to earth. He notes there are numerous references to a heavenly council or assembly in various parts of the Bible, Genesis, Psalms, Kings, Job, and it includes the term the accuser, who was part of the council, but sometimes this word accuser was translated Satan. And at that point, Wallis went, what? So let me see what I've got here. I'm going to give you a little tidbit here from the book. He said, joining these dots really had me scratching my head. How could I have read so much and yet missed so much? This was news to me. Here in the Bible is a heavenly council populated by a diversity of entities, not all good, heavenly, but not all good. Some at least who are spirits and who are all Elohim kind. That's an interesting counsel. He says words change their meanings over time. A classic example from monastic history, and you know how I love words, is the word chapter. So originally the word chapter referred to a portion of the monastic constitution, which could be read once a week at a special gathering of members in a special assembly room. After a while, the word chapter sort of morphed in usage to refer to the assembly room in which this constitution was read. After another while, chapter came to refer to the groups of people assembled in the room to hear the constitution read, and still later, chapter came to mean the local gathering of any association of people. So today, if you read the word chapter, to know what it means, you'll need to let the date and context tell you which incarnation of chapter you're reading about. And now, to know why a group of people is called a chapter, you need to know what it meant way back in the beginning. So you have a chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. You have groups of different orders of nuns or priests that are called chapters. So the word has taken on new meanings, which often happens. Where did I go? So he says, take that into consideration reading the Bible. This is a translation of a translation of a translation. It's gone through political editing, and words change automatically in one consistent language through time. Words change their meaning. This is a lot. It's no wonder this is confusing. He wonders, does Elohim change meaning over time like the word chapter? Could Elohim be the council? Nobody seems to know. So is this about translating a plural as an abstract? For example, we say the nobility, the management. It's singular, but it's a plural. So do we say royalty is getting anachronistic? Today we still debate about that. Do we say royalty is, or do we say royalty are getting anachronistic? We still debate about that. So the question is, which do you use, the singular or plural form of the verb? And what do you mean by your choice of verb? It's still a big debate today in English language. But this view still means Elohim are plural. The root means, and then he goes into an explanation of the actual derivation of the word itself from its original roots. It's really interesting, but it's complicated, and you should read the book. But I'll gloss over that the root means reading the word as a plural noun, and it best fits the grammar and context of translation to read it as a plural noun and put the words of Elohim in context of a conversation between members of a group. And now you have a whole different slant on the Bible. Let us make man in the image and likeness of ourselves. So that is more like eavesdropping on a conversation. Okay. So theologians need this all to be received wisdom, and I mean that's their goal going into it. They're interpreting all of this with that lens of this is what we're hoping we can get out of this story, and they want to twist themselves into knots to avoid questions about the inconsistencies. So Wallis is not satisfied with conventional explanations. He says the questions are fudged, the answers are painful in their twisting and turning. When Elohim is taken to be a powerful group, the entire backstory of Genesis changes and an older context is revealed. And it rewrites our understanding of who, what, and from where humans came. So he's going to go back and look at it with this new interpretation in mind, new interpretation of the words, and not changing the words, but just looking at them slightly differently. And this is what translators do. You know, I have translated a little bit of Latin, not a lot, not well, but it seems so straightforward, right? The words on a page, you get your dictionary, you look it up, and there's your translation. No, that's not how language works. And we are so familiar with English, and we have absorbed it into our bloodstream. It never occurs to us to ask about the nuances. We don't notice them, and we shouldn't be expected to. That's for linguistic nerds to figure out. But people who do translations understand that tweaking one slight little word can change the entire meaning of something. It's really incredible, and it's very frustrating as a translator because you can go down many paths, and most of them are only one is correct. Okay, chapter 2, the humans and the others. So going into search for the original narratives of the Elohim changed his understanding of God, what God's role in the world is, and where humans come from. It was a paradigm shift for him. So it is significant that this man is a Christian pastor. I think I don't want to misspeak, but I think he's actually like a college trained theologian, which means he's been around the block a couple of times as far as doctrine and dogma and the roots of Christian belief. This is not something unfamiliar to him. He's simply looking at it from a different angle. So now he had lots of time, thanks to Ultimate Frisbee, to do a deep dive into word origins, translations, meanings, and grammar. Very complicated in the best of times with a modern language. And it could change the narrative in substantive ways. And he gives examples. The word Adam, originally the roots of it mean of the earth. And related in English, for example, are words like human, which means the thing of the earth or the thing of the soil originally. Earthlings, earth means soil and planet. So already we're getting nuance here. And therefore the stories of Adam are stories of earthlings, of people of the soil of the planet Earth. Eve, the origins of that mean the living. So the stories of Eve are the stories of the living. The Elohim, he said he wanted to rework that whole thing, and he starts to reread Genesis with a completely different perspective. So in Genesis, the earth starts in darkness. There's empty, barren stuff, and the earth is covered in water. And a powerful spirit beings come, hover, orbit the earth, and now there's light, now there's sun, now there are moon and stars. And all these planet formers, he says, okay, let's ask this question. Are these some sort of advanced beings terraforming a primordial soup? Is that what's going on? He's not saying don't follow your faith as you want to follow it, but let's just look at this in a slightly different way. Do they exist in a heavenly realm, as the Bible describes, another dimension? with the ability to manifest and to function in 4D reality outside of our time and space, our space-time paradigm? That's an interesting question. And I would just gently remind you of Linda Moulton Howe's book and how that ended. Are we talking here, he says. Now, this is coming from a Christian pastor. I think this is remarkably courageous of him, because this is really sticking your neck out. Are we talking about multi or trans-dimensional beings? Let's think about that. And just even to use the word terraformer is huge, because that implies a certain, I don't know, I don't want to say non-divinity, but it implies there's a lot of weight behind the word terraformer. So you go on to create everything these guys do on the planet, including, very important, gold in the Mideast. And eventually they create a male human from the soil, and then they create a female companion. And these humans live in harmony. They're vegan. They don't kill animals. There's peace. There's no eating animals. It's like the Garden of Eden. So eventually, the humans have a conversation with a snake. Now, where did this thing come from? What's this all about? So this is the beginning part of the text. Whoever compiled the New Testament correlated this early snake with other figures of mythology. This is really interesting. Think dragons, the great dragon. Think the serpent. Think the devil, or AKA the accuser. All linked throughout mythology from many cultures. And early on, this is referred to as part of the heavenly council. So this is not, coming up from the bowels of hell. This guy was in heaven, according to Genesis. The snake shows them how to raise their consciousness and to improve life. And the female, as it usually is, takes the lead in the upgrade. And they develop a moral conscience. They develop sexuality. And they develop self-awareness. And so they start wearing clothes. And birth and gender roles and society and trouble for humans all are a result of this, because of the conflict amongst the makers, the creators, plural. In many texts, it's described as an all-out war between powerful ones. So this council's not so perfect because they're at each other's throats. Now, he's referring to a whole lot of ancient texts, and we're going to name them and talk about them. But for now, this is sort of a general review of what the story could be taken from other places. These powerful beings have their own wills. They all have their own separate agendas. They're not so heavenly. He says the council's made up of these Elohim, the powerful ones, and not just one single divine God. So how could all these wise moral creatures, or a single wise moral God, fail at the beginning to make male and female, not desire humans to be morally aware? How could he hold humans culpable for this? It was his decision, not theirs. He put them in that situation. How could he hold humans culpable, and why would he punish moral awareness with lifelong hard labor, childbirth, and death? Why wouldn't an all-knowing God anticipate any of this? Why would an all-loving God set it up this way? Why didn't an all-knowing God anticipate the snake? And why would he create the snake? If he created everything, he created the snake. Why would he create the snake? And why would his failure to anticipate these eventualities lead God to regret making humans? So this is just a moral distortion when they say God is wrong, unpredictable, and cruel. Anybody reading this without an agenda, just reading it with a clean slate, you would have to deduce from this that this God is cruel and immoral and vengeful. So there's a falling out between the members of this council, and the ones that were pro-snake were outnumbered 2-1. Therefore, the snake was exiled to the earth, and the humans were kicked out of Eden after their little encounter with the snake, and contact with the powerful ones who saw this interaction with the snake and didn't approve. So people start to have children. People begin to die. And I've always wondered, who did Cain and Abel died, but who did Cain marry? I always wondered about that. And then Cain, and we won't even talk about Lilith. What's up with that? And then Cain kills Abel, and he's banished, and the human population grows somehow. And they encounter other Elohim who abduct and impregnate female humans and give birth to giants. And then this leads him to ask, the author to ask, so are these the demigods, the titans of other mythologies? So this narrative repeats in most global mythologies. 28 hybrids are named in Greek mythology. 17 are named in Hindu mythology. And there are several more. There's one hybrid prominent in Celtic mythology. So we have these, sometimes they're called heroes, but often they're demigods. And we have people like Achilles and Aeneas and Hercules and Perseus and Theseus and Orpheus, and not to forget Helen of Troy. Okay, so the Elohim decide that human life is too long. These troublemaking human people are hanging around too long, and they live very long lives according to the early Bible. Remember Methuselah, over 900 years. So they didn't like this. They didn't like the hybrids that had been produced. So they decide to wipe the slate clean with the flood. And this was not unanimous. Somebody warned Noah. And they create this deluge. And this deluge is a myth consistent across the planet. Almost every single culture, mythology, has a flood myth. After the flood, Noah and the animals emerge from the ark, and the Elohim make a promise of a rainbow, swear not to do it again, and humanity is the result with the genes of Noah's family, which is just 5 families, but they were all Noah's family. So they spread out and they settle in Mesopotamia. We're summarizing, a few thousands of years. They spread out in Sumeria and Babylon. Now, the Tower of Babel, another cruel act, if you really think about what's going on here. He parses the language and he says that the Tower of Babel was meant to be a gateway to the Elohim. It was a way for the humans to communicate with the gods, to reach heaven from earth. And the Elohim didn't like it. And so they created confusion with many languages to prevent people from consolidating into a unified society. Now, what kind of all-loving God would do that? You would want unity. Why would an all-loving God feel threatened? So he recognized that Genesis is a retelling of some earlier myths, and then he asks the big question that's always asked. Are they myths, or is this an early attempt at recording history that has been manipulated and retold and changed and reinterpreted over thousands of years? But there's a consistency in events across the globe, making reference to things from the same time frame, explaining them differently within a context of different cultures. But so how am I doing for time here? Okay. So Abraham comes next in the Bible, and Abraham came from Ur. And I know the big joke in the 5th grade was Abraham tied his ass to a tree and walked to Ur. walked from Ur. Hilarious, right? So Wallis says that Genesis has been presented as the correct narrative to the older stories. So these older stories have been absorbed into Genesis, but tweaked. And if the Elohim, if that's a plural, then Genesis confirms the Sumerian myths. If you don't read the conventional reading of Elohim and God, and you take them to be plural, as they apparently originally were intended, if you do the linguistics, then what you end up with is a story from the Bible that actually supports Zechariah Sitchin. It actually agrees with ancient Sumerian myth. I think we have time to do another chapter. He says, strange, I've seen that face before. I don't remember. It's been a while since I read this book, so this is new to me too. This tells the story of an 1835 11-year-old who was lowered down a cliff by British soldiers in Behistun. I probably did not pronounce that correctly, but it cliffs in Iran. To read an inscription on a rock wall far above the ground. They could see the inscription. So they went to the top of the cliff and lowered this kid down to copy the inscription. But guess what he found? That this was cuneiform, that it was the world's most ancient writing. This is when they would take tablets of clay, and while they were still damp, they would press a wedge shape into them to write words, and the relationship of the wedges, the shape of the wedges, the arrangement to each other created words. It was their writing, and it's the world's most ancient, and it came from about 5.5 millennia ago. And it was actually in use, daily use, until the 1st century AD, but it fell into obscurity. You know, the Romans. And it was rediscovered in the 1500s on thousands of clay tablets that were found in several archaeological sites in that same area of Mesopotamia. And these clay tablets were kept up under lock and key in museums for 4 centuries. Scholars didn't know what the writing meant. They didn't know how to interpret it. They actually didn't realize it was writing. For a long time, they thought it was decoration. And in 1835, the discovery on the cliff wall was key. It was a royal proclamation in 3 different languages: Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, all in cuneiform. And since they knew the other languages, they could translate. And this is called the Behistun inscription. And it's similar in import for cuneiform as the Rosetta Stone was for hieroglyphics. It's a code breaker. The Rosetta Stone, found during Napoleon's time, I believe, had Egyptian hieroglyphics, and then it had, I don't know if it was ancient Greek, I don't remember, but it had a couple other languages, and they were able to do a cross-translation, and it broke the code of all these hieroglyphics. They had no idea what they meant. It's a window into a forgotten world. It revealed more than 200,000 stored tablets, what they contained. And what they found, some of it was pretty dull. They had legal notes and business agreements and banking statements and inventories and shipping lists. They found a lot of business papers, but you can infer a lot from that kind of information. And they did provide stories of human beginnings. That was also found, a few origin stories. And these stories were bizarre, but they contained familiar motifs. And he said it was odd to read them because they seemed so foreign until they're not. You start to recognize characters, events, themes, and as he said, motifs. You start to get a sense of the familiar. I've heard this story before. The 19th century discoverers and translators recognized these similarities, and this really upset the religious communities. European and American Christian mainstream communities freaked out. These early sources, cuneiform, predated Bible sources by a lot. And the authors of them made reference to even earlier sources that they had used. So there were sources way before these cuneiform tablets. What and who were they and who wrote them? And these were already ancient narratives when they were put on clay tablets as early as 3000 BC. So where'd they come from? He summarizes using the early Sumerian names. So we get some similarities, but we're going to use the Sumerian characters now. So before creation, the source of all things was Anu. He was a god. He was a being from the sky is what he was. And the earth was in darkness. Anu separated salt water and fresh water. And one was male, one was female. And they brought forth other beings. They were entities, these separations. And they brought forth other beings to collaborate in creating the world. First, they started with the light, and eventually all of these powerful beings are around, and what do? They start to fight. And they're fighting for power. They're fighting for control. A council is created to bring order. The head of the council is a guy called Enlil, which translates air lord. And he is the Sumerian sky god. The earth is empty, the earth is barren, and the sky people explore the area, and they decide to call it Eden, and they fill it with plants, and they fill it with animals, and it's located near the Tigris and the Euphrates, and Mesopotamia, and that means between the rivers. Enlil, the air lord, confers with his brother Enki, the Earth Lord, and they decide to create humans. Enki gets put in charge of Earth and humans with the help of Nama, like a female, and the blood or the DNA of a sky person is put into clay, and this produces a human. Enki helps with the help of a nurse, and the first human males that they created lived in harmony with the animals and were vegan. This female sky person gives them bread and beer and teaches them how to cultivate crops. Well, bread and beer, that's pretty much all these guys need, right? And the sky people do create a female then. And because of the presence of the female, they develop self-awareness and sexuality, and they put on clothes. And this is actually specifically mentioned in these clay tablets. Many cultural myths talk about humans being at one with nature, talking with animals, and not eating animals. Many. The Aboriginal walkabout is a ritual time in the bush alone with nature that is like the vestiges of this unity with nature. We have distant memories that come out in our culture. For example, Tarzan. Mowgli, the Jungle Book. There's a theme of an awakening and an educating and a civilizing of the wild man, consistent through all cultures. So humans were created to relieve the sky people of menial work. So basically it was a worker population, a slave population, and especially to grow crops so that the sky gods could eat. What sky gods were eating? Crops grown on the earth. Okay. So 300 of these sky people looked after the earth, and 300 observed and watched and protected the earth from stations in the sky on Nibiru. And if anybody recognizes that, it's because there's a lot of discussion today about the Milky Way. Was that a planet Nibiru that exploded? I'm really condensing the story, but there's that speculation. So humans procreate, they become crowded, and they become hard to manage, these 300 guys that are managing the earth. And the council decides, okay, we have to lower the lifespan. Too many of these creatures are surviving and they're reproducing, and it's getting unmanageable. They hear reports that women were kidnapped by members of the gods and the 300 and creating hybrids. So Enlil decides to flood the earth and cleanse it, but not all the council agrees. Enki warns a guy on earth, the king of a place called Surapak, a king called Ziusudra. Enki tells him how to build a rescue vessel and stock up. There's a flood. The people on the boat release a bird 3 times to see if it will find a place to sit, and if it doesn't come back, it's found land, and it's safe for them to try to dock the boat. And when the water goes down and the bird doesn't return, they release the animals. The council has a little bit of remorse and regrets the death. It condemns the killings, and it affirms that it has personal accountability as a group and won't do it again. A voice tells this guy they rescued on this boat to go east, and he goes to Babylon and works there. And they build a tower that's used by technicians who send observers to the sky station in Nibiru. It mentions biblical tales of many battles, and he mentions biblical tales of many battles with various mythological enemies, and the question is, okay, these stories from the Bible, how old are they really? In the book of Revelation, the cuneiform is condensed, so they've taken stories from these ancient cuneiform tablets and added them to the book of Revelation. For example, and then there was a war in heaven. That's a quote from one of these cuneiform tablets. So the tablets in Genesis are the same. It's the same story. And so this is taboo to undermine divine authorship. How dare you say that these ancient people wrote the story of the Bible and that the Bible was, plagiarized from ancient mythology. When Professor Nathaniel Schmidt of Colgate University showed these parallels, he was tried for heresy in 1895 and fired from Colgate University in 1896. He went on to work at Cornell for 36 years. The author teaches, okay, I'm going to try to say this, hermeneutics. I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce it correctly. These are tools that are used to interpret ancient texts. And his mainstream church that he belongs to, the peers that he knows in that church, said the Bible is 100% true, but earlier stories that it was based on are false. So don't believe those ancient people. They were all wrong. Believe the Bible, which is exactly the same story as the ancient stories. So you're talking about taking the Bible literally and considering the characters in the Bible as true historical living figures. And you're saying that they were descendants of fictional characters. And so he saw this council of the Sumerian sky people as an equivalent of the council of the powerful ones in Genesis. And he says if these are the same, and Yahweh is not the Elohim and a separate entity, so then what do we have? What we have is page 40. Another detail is from the time the kingship descended from the heavens to the time of the flood, and then once more the kingship descended from the heavens. So they're talking about gods. They're talking about going back and forth from the heavens. And Joshua in the Bible tells them the Elohim serve their church, the church that they, church in the sense of their religion. And he says, forget the sky people. We're going to go with the Elohim. The children of Israel dump the powerful ones of Egypt and Sumeria, and they follow Yahweh, the angry God. But who were the sky people if they weren't gods? or God, singular. There's this, what? It's confusing because it is confusing. So there's a clue in the tablets. There's a list of kings of Sumeria in history, real history. They really did exist from before the flood. And this lists dynasties with kings of 30,000 year lifespans. Okay. So, and what modern interpreters will try to say, well, it was a different kind of year. The Sumerians were very precise about all sorts of things. They found all those business records, and they were detailed down to the, well, they didn't have pennies, down to the smallest coin. They were detailed and specific and accurate to each other. And then all of a sudden they're fast and loose about ages, 30,000, 65, it's the same thing. So the Sumerians had extreme math and writing skills. They knew things that other people didn't know for a very, very long time. The Babylonians used Sumerian math to measure and record solar eclipses. Scientists have used this science exactly like the Babylonians ever since. And they later used the Babylonian calculations in modern time to calculate the Earth's deceleration. Don't even ask me. But there's also a correlation between this timeline of the kings from ancient times that they found and the Earth's precession, the wobble that results in the equinoxes. Okay. Oh, I already read that. Okay. So the word monarchy, they believe that the idea and the word comes from the gods. Monarchy means one leader. And this concept, they believe, comes from this notion of the god, like from Sumeria and Egypt. These gods, or whatever they were the progenitors of the monarchical lines. So monarchy originally in the past was an actual DNA connection to these creators. Not so much today, right? So King Gilgamesh was a hybrid, and he was the hero of the oldest epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. In April of 2003, a tomb was found, and it matches descriptions from the Epic of Gilgamesh. But because Iraq war was going on and ISIS was there, they couldn't go back, and they still can't go back. So who were these sky people? They were from the sky. They had a space station up there. They terraformed. They were genetic engineers. They were very long-lived. They were mortal, because they did eventually die. They used high technology. They battled each other for power. And then he asks the big question, were these ETs, were these entities from another dimension, another time, another planet? What's going on here? So he began to consult experts, and he said this became a paradigm-shifting voyage of discovery for him. And that's the end of the chapter, and it's a perfect place to stop this presentation for the moment. So that's the end of video number 1, and we will be back here very shortly with video number 2. And I hope you're enjoying this, because I just love this stuff. So we'll see where the journey takes us. It's long before.